May 1945. The most devastating war in human history just ended, and scattered across Europe sat thousands of the most feared machines ever built. What happened to them next is a story most history books skipped entirely. Stay with me to the end. The guns went silent. The Nazi war machine had collapsed. Adolf Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. And right across the scarred landscapes of Europe, from the frozen forests of the Eastern Front to the sun-baked roads of southern France, thousands of German tanks just sat there, abandoned, battle-worn. Some are still fully loaded with ammunition, some are still warm from their last engagement. We are talking about Panthers, Tigers, Panzer IVs, Jag Panthers, and Tiger IIs, the most technologically aggressive armored vehicles the world had ever seen up to that point. And now, they belong to nobody. Or more accurately, they belong to whoever got there first. That, right there, is where this story gets deeply interesting. The scramble begins. The moment the war ended, Allied forces fanned out across their respective occupation zones and began cataloging everything they could find. Tanks were scattered across the Ruhr, Bavaria, and the bombed-out streets of Berlin. Many of them had been deliberately immobilized by their own crews, who didn't want the Allies getting their hands on functioning machines. Others had simply run out of fuel, because by late 1944, Germany's fuel supply chain had basically been bombed into dust. But here's what people don't fully appreciate. These weren't just war trophies. These were intelligence gold mines. The Americans, the British, and the Soviets all understood that German engineering had pushed armored vehicle design to places nobody else had reached yet, and they wanted to know exactly how far. So the cataloging wasn't casual. It was urgent, competitive, and thorough. Aberdeen Proving Ground, America's war school. The Americans moved fast. They shipped select German vehicles across the Atlantic to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, which had been the U.S. Army's primary weapons testing facility since World War I. Aberdeen became the classroom where American engineers sat down with German tanks and basically tore them apart to understand what made them tick. And what they found was a contradiction. On one hand, German tanks were undeniably superior in key areas. The optics on a Panther were so precise that German crews could identify and engage targets at distances that left Allied tank commanders genuinely shaken. The firepower on the Tiger I and Tiger II was in a completely different league. An 88mm gun fired from a Tiger could punch through Allied armor at ranges where return fire was basically useless. But here's the thing. German tanks were also mechanical nightmares. The Panther, for all its brilliance, broke down constantly. The Tiger II was so heavy that it destroyed bridges and got stuck in terrain that lighter tanks crossed without a second thought. The transmission systems were overly complex. The engines ran hot. And keeping these vehicles operational required a level of mechanical expertise and spare parts that Germany simply couldn't sustain by 1944 and 1945. The Americans documented all of this, and it directly shaped how they would think about tank design going forward. The British go to work in Germany. The British approach was slightly different. Rather than shipping everything back home, they established technical evaluation sites right there in Germany. Hillersleben and Sennelager became British testing grounds where engineers put captured German armor through its paces on native soil. The findings echoed what the Americans discovered: superior in some ways, fragile in others, expensive to produce, difficult to maintain. The British were particularly interested in the relationship between German tank design philosophy and the actual outcomes on the battlefield, because they had fought these machines in North Africa and Normandy and knew firsthand what it felt like to be on the wrong end of an 88. Their conclusions fed directly into British post-war armored doctrine, Kummersdorf, the discovery that made jaws drop. Now, while standard tanks were being collected and tested, Allied forces stumbled onto something at Kummersdorf, a German military research site south of Berlin, that genuinely stopped people in their tracks. Kummersdorf had been Germany's primary weapons development and testing facility since the 1870s. By the time the Allies arrived, it was a treasure chest of experimental and prototype vehicles that never made it into mass production. Engineers found evidence of the Maus program there, which was Germany's attempt to build a super-heavy tank so massive it could only move under its own weight and would have been functionally useless on most European roads and bridges. The Maus weighed nearly 200 tons. One was found incomplete. Another had been partially destroyed. They also found traces of the E-Series program, which was Germany's late-war attempt to standardize tank production across a series of designs ranging from light tanks to ultra-heavy assault vehicles. Most of it never left the drawing board or early prototype stage, but what was found confirmed just how ambitious and sometimes deeply impractical German military engineering had become in the final years of the war. The order to destroy. By 1946, the Allied Control Council, the governing body made up of American, British, French, and Soviet representatives that was running occupied Germany, issued clear directives. German military equipment had to be destroyed. All of it. The goal was simple. Make sure Germany could never again build up the kind of military-industrial machine that had plunged the world into 6 years of catastrophic war. The systematic destruction of German armor took place on a massive scale. Tanks were cut apart with industrial torches, hulls were crushed, engines were seized and stripped. And all of that steel, all that carefully crafted German armor plating, got melted down and recycled. And here's something that hits differently when you really think about it. The steel from Tiger tanks ended up in the bridges and housing blocks being built to reconstruct the very cities those tanks had once defended. German armor became German infrastructure. There's something almost poetic about that, even if the circumstances were brutal. Tanks in the river. Austria's creative solution. Not every abandoned tank went to a scrapyard or a testing facility. Some ended up in genuinely unexpected places. Along the Enns River in Austria, engineers used the hulls of abandoned German tanks to help stabilize the riverbanks. The tanks were rolled or dragged into position and essentially became part of the landscape, their armor plating doing the unglamorous but useful work of preventing erosion. Nobody was firing guns anymore. The machines that had once been instruments of war were now holding a riverbank together. Others were used as target hulks for Allied gunnery practice. Crews who would never face German armor in combat could at least train against real German steel, learning how to identify weak points and practice accuracy on authentic targets. France kept the Panthers running. Here's where the story pivots in a direction most people don't expect. Not all German tanks were destroyed or tested to pieces. Several Allied nations made a very practical decision. Why build new tanks when perfectly good ones are sitting right there? France, in particular, integrated captured German armor into its own military in a serious way. The 503rd Combat Tank Regiment, a French armored unit, operated Panther tanks well into the post-war period. These were the same Panthers that had fought against French forces during the liberation of France. Now French crews were climbing into them, learning their quirks, and keeping them operational. The French used Panthers until 1951. 6 years after the war ended, a French soldier could look out from a Panther's cupola and think of it simply as his tank. Czechoslovakia kept building. Czechoslovakia took things even further. Rather than just operating captured German designs, they kept manufacturing them. The Hetzer, a highly effective German tank destroyer that had entered service in 1944, became the G-13 in Czech production. Czechoslovak factories churned out G-13s after the war and sold them to Switzerland, where they served into the 1970s. Think about that timeline. A tank design born out of wartime Germany, produced by a post-war Czechoslovak factory, sold to neutral Switzerland, and still in active service 3 decades after the war that created it had ended. Spain, Franco's armored inheritance. Francisco Franco's Spain had maintained a complicated relationship with Nazi Germany during the war. Spain was officially neutral, but Franco had sent the Blue Division of Spanish volunteers to fight alongside German forces on the Eastern Front. After the war, Spain ended up with a number of German vehicles through various channels, including Panzer IVs and Stug assault guns. The Spanish military used these vehicles well into the post-war decades, not because Spain was secretly trying to revive the Third Reich, but simply because these were the vehicles they had, and replacing them cost money Spain didn't have. Syria and the Golan Heights, the last chapter. Save the best for last, and I mean that, because this part of the story is the one that genuinely makes people stop and replay it to make sure they heard it right. Syria, through acquisitions from Czechoslovakia and Spain, ended up operating German Panzer IVs, and those Panzer IVs, built in Germany during World War II, were still being used by the Syrian military on the Golan Heights in the 1960s and into the 1970s. The Golan Heights, against Israeli forces, nearly 30 years after those tanks had rolled off German assembly lines during a war that involved a completely different world order. That is one of the longest operational lifespans of any tank in history. Machines designed by engineers in Nazi Germany, operated by Wehrmacht crews on the Eastern Front and in North Africa, then sold across multiple borders and used in a completely unrelated Middle Eastern conflict decades later. By the time Syrian crews were using Panzer IVs on the Golan Heights, the soldiers who had originally crewed those same tanks in Germany were middle-aged men living in the Federal Republic of Germany, raising families, and watching the news. The museums preserve what survived. By the mid-1950s, most nations had retired German armor in favor of standardized American or Soviet equipment. NATO allies got American tanks. Warsaw Pact members got Soviet tanks. The old German machines, finally exhausted and obsolete, were either scrapped or saved. The ones that were saved ended up in museums. The Tank Museum at Bovington in England holds some of the finest examples in existence, including a rare Tiger I that was captured in Tunisia in 1943 and remains one of the best preserved tigers anywhere in the world. The Musée des Blindés at Saumur in France preserves a remarkable collection of armored vehicles, including German examples that served with the French military after the war. And then there's the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow. The Soviet Union was, without question, the most aggressive collector of German experimental and rare vehicles after the war, and Kubinka reflects that. Vehicles that exist nowhere else on Earth sit in those halls, including examples of designs so rare that they represent the only surviving proof those machines ever existed. Kubinka is not just a museum. It is an archive of mechanical history that the Soviets quietly assembled, while the rest of the world was focusing on rebuilding. If you never see anything else about the legacy of German armored engineering after World War II, get yourself to Kubinka. If this video gave you something to think about, drop a comment below with the fact that surprised you the most. Was it the Panzer IVs on the Golan Heights, Kubinka? Let me know. Subscribe to the channel because there is a whole lot more where this came from. Hit the bell so you never miss a drop. And share this video with someone who loves history, because conversations like this one deserve a bigger room. History is never as simple as winners and losers. The machines keep moving long after the war is over.